Every once in a while, you have someone in an industry who understands the nuance, who understands the background, who understands what really goes on. And that person then speaks out. They become kind of like a whistleblower. And in this case, the person I'm speaking to, Hedley Rees, has a lot of background information and understanding of supply chains, the pharmaceutical industry, and he has very clear insights as to what should happen and where things should go. But he is a lone voice. And I keep on asking him, why is it that they don't like you so much? But in reality, when you hear him break down his thoughts and why he thinks this is, you understand why he feels more like a threat to industry than someone that they would embrace. But what we have the luxury of is getting an insight into what really is going on. So without further ado, I'll bring in Hedley. Hi, Hedley. How are you?
Hi, Philip. Yeah, I'm very good, thanks. And it's great to see you again. And you're such a good interviewer. I'm looking forward to this.
Excellent, excellent. So what I'm going to ask you to do first, Hedley, is just to introduce yourself to the audience. Tell them a bit about yourself and your background, and then we will get into the discussion.
Okay, yes, very happy to do that. So they call me a veteran of the biotech and pharmaceutical industry because I've been 40 years in the industry. I started off in 1980 working for a manufacturing and packaging plant in Wales, which was owned by Bayer, the German chemical company. And I really learned the practice of manufacturing drugs, procurement, inventory management, working with some of the best systems money could buy. And while I was there at the end, I did an MBA at Executive MBA at Cranford University. And I then moved into the biotech industry. Now, biotech is where companies they use outsourced contractors. They use what they call contract development and manufacturing organizations and contract research organizations to do all the scientific and the technical work and all the physical work. And they manage those companies with a small staff of experts. So I really learned what it was like to work with outsourced supply chains. And it's quite challenging because you've got the commercial relationships as well as the actual manufacturing aspects of it. In 2005, I helped launch a drug in the US called Tarceva, which was partnered with Genentech in South San Francisco. I was head of supply chain for that. And it launched in the US. And once it launched, I was based in Oxford. I was made redundant basically because they didn't need me in the US. And I formed PharmaFlow, which is a consultancy offering services to companies developing drugs, supply chain services and drug development services. I've written 2 books over that time. The first was in 2011 for Wiley, called Supply Chain Management in the Drug Industry, Delivering Patient Value for Pharmaceuticals and Biologics. And this year published is Transforming the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain, again for Wiley, and that's a copy of it there. That's available now if I can give it a plug just here. But my passion actually is bringing doctors and clinicians back into the drug development process as early as possible, because at the moment we just have scientists doing molecular modeling, thinking they've found a drug, and then 10 years later it's not successful because the drug they picked really, or the molecule they picked wasn't suitable. So I've developed a sort of a persona whereby I'm trying to help people understand the complexities of the supply chain. The supply chain in pharmaceuticals is like any other product supply chain, be it an aero engine, an aircraft, an automobile, or silicon chip. It goes through lots of stages, prototyping, etc. And I think few people understand that. People think that drugs are found by accident. The whole penicillin with Alexander Fleming. His accidental finding didn't bring penicillin to market, although it was very important. But it took supply chain people and safety people, chemists, to actually bring penicillin to market as a collaboration, and that took 16 years. Now, most people don't know that. So I think I'll leave it there if that helps, Philip.
Wonderful. Yes. And something caught my interest as you started talking, because you mentioned about bringing clinicians back into the drug development system. And it touches on something that I've been reflecting on. And the principle that people don't get is that for most diseases, it's rarely a single drug. What you need is a toolbox. And you need good drugs that can work together in a way that they leverage the benefit of each other. When we think of hypertension and all the drugs that we have, it's a toolbox. When we think of heart failure, when you think of diabetes, it's not any one drug that is able to do everything. And critically, different people respond in different ways. So we need different tools to be able to help people to get better. And I agree with you that this miracle one drug approach is actually causing damage to the whole scientific and medical industry. Any thoughts on that?
Oh yes, absolutely. Because I talk about doctors developing drugs themselves, repurposing drugs. Through COVID, we had ivermectin and other drugs where doctors were using off-label and finding, some impressive results. What the doctors don't have is knowledge of the supply chain, of the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. How you set up a supply chain, firstly to test the drug for safety before going into humans, and then testing the drug for safety when it goes into clinical trials. And if doctors understood this aspect of it, they will understand, they're medically trained, they'll understand the clinical aspects, they'll understand the safety aspects, what they call the drug metabolism and pharmacokinetics. What they won't have knowledge of is how to build the supply chain, but it's not rocket science. It's very methodical. It's very well sort of laid out by the regulators. So does that help, Philip?
Oh, yes, yes. So I wanted to, as you were talking, and I realized we were kind of moving beyond one of the questions that I know the audience has. And the question is straight to the point, talking about the pandemic. When you think about supply chains and the systems that need to be put in place in order to do safe delivery of a therapeutic or medication or manufacture, how was it possible to be done with Operation Warp Speed? If I had put you in charge of that, could you have done it with all the resources available to you within a year?
No, and to explain that, I need to tell you how the drug development process works. So if you think you've got a molecular compound that could become a drug, first of all, you have to manufacture it. And you build a small supply chain. It's typically 15 kilos or 15 liters if it's a liquid. And that's made up of what they call starting materials, raw materials, starting materials, and drug substance. So the drug substance is what you make. It's called active pharmaceutical ingredient in Europe, and drug substance in the US. So you have to buy the raw materials, you have to make the starting material, and then that goes into the drug substance. And typically that's going to take you about 18 months because, building a supply chain, you've got to appoint these contractors, you've got to have agreements with them. There's all the commercials to work out. And when you've made that 15 kilos, you send it off to a contract research organization. Some of them specialize in animal testing, they're testing animal models. and that goes off, and they administer the drug substance, maybe a powder, whatever, to animals, and they write reports and they let the company know if they've found the drug to be safe.
So, quick question in that: would it be the same for a drug as it is for a vaccine, or would it be much easier or much more difficult?
Much more difficult for the vaccine. The extent of the testing for carcinogenicity, toxicity is exhaustive, and you've got either small molecule drugs or biologic drugs. Now, small molecule drugs are made by industrial chemistry, so you have fine chemicals manufacturers, and they make an active ingredient and drug substance, and you can actually test it, and you know exactly what it is. With a biologic, because the molecules are so large, you can't actually identify a biologic because it's just too large a molecule to be able to test. And issues like that exist with biologics, the sensitivity to temperature, and these vaccines were being shipped at minus 70 degrees C or minus 20 degrees C. And when you thaw a vaccine, or any biologic, it's very risky because you've got to prove that the frozen material you start off with, when you thaw it, you've got the same molecular structure as you started with. So you have to do 3 thaw studies to prove that. Now, I don't think anything was happening like that was happening in vaccination centers. But so anyway, it's going to take at least 3 years because the US Government Accountability Office in 2006, now this is gold standard data. The US GAO is, don't mess about. And they published a report which said it takes 3 years to carry out the non-clinical testing before you go into humans. And it takes 7 years to do the clinical testing. So you've got 3 phases. You've got phase 1, which basically is in healthy volunteers. You've got phase 2, where you do the dose ranging studies, and then phase 3, where you do the studies in the chosen dose. And once you've done all that, you have to collect all the data from the supply chain, from the clinical results and the safety testing, and you have to put it into what they call an electronic common technical document. Now, this is harmonized globally. It has been for 20, 30 years by the International Conference on Harmonization. Every regulatory authority in the world used this. So before COVID, if you wanted to get a drug approved, you get to the stage where you've got all your data, you've done the non-clinical testing, the clinical testing, and then you submit that. And typically it takes 12 to 18 months for the regulator to review the document and say either it's approvable or not.
So I'm gonna stretch you a bit, Hedley. So I'm going to take you back to 2020. I'm going to assume that at the time, say Trump called you in, and he said, "Listen, Hedley, you are in charge of this process. Warp speed. I don't care how you do it. I just want you to get a vaccine ready in about 6 months of testing and in about 9 months to get to the public." What shortcuts would you have to take in order to do it in such a short period of time?
Well, the first would be you'd have to do no safety testing whatsoever. And then you would set up clinical studies. As I said before, the shortest lead time to set up are the clinical studies because you recruit patients on. You may get 200 patients on the study, and you get a result in 6 or 9 months. But of course, that's the shortest part of it. The longest part always is the supply chain. So, and what they did was they run all 3 phases of clinical studies together in parallel. Now, you can't do that because as the clinical studies get larger and larger, as you go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, you have to scale up in the supply chain. And every time you scale up, you have to redo the safety studies because effectively you've got a different product. You know, what you produce at one scale, if you double the scale, you may well be producing something quite different. It's not unusual for drugs to fail in later stage clinical trials because they became toxic at a higher scale. Now, none of that was done. So effectively there was no testing for the safety of the various lots or batch sizes. And we know how the size of the batch sizes, we you know, the volumes we had for COVID.
Yeah, because we're talking about billions of doses. I think the last count, it was over 14 billion doses of vaccines have been given out across all of them. So when you think about it that way, I can understand it if they gave you 9 months to do it and you had to take whatever shortcuts that had to be done. But once you had achieved the aim, do you then go back and do the safety testing? Or do you just presume that if a whole bunch of people didn't die, everything is okay?
Well, you can't go back and do the safety testing because you have to go back in time. You know, because once they've been made without being safety tested in animals before going into humans, and they're out there, then whatever happens, and you can't sort of go back and redo it unless, as I say, you could sort of go back in time.
So it raises one question that I remember targeting some time ago, is that I remember seeing one of the FDA documents talking about animal studies, and one of the reassurances to the public is that they recognized that there was a time limitation in terms of doing normal standard safety studies, but they were doing animal studies in parallel. This is what was the plan. So they would be running alongside human studies with animal studies to then see what was happening. But when I look carefully, they started the animal studies, but I think by the second dose, they killed all the animals and said it was okay. So we don't have any parallel animal studies for booster 1, booster 2, booster 3, booster 4, because you're right. Each one of the interventions should, in theory, have parallel studies. But as I thought about it, I thought, what is the difference then with, say, a flu vaccine? Because we get updated flu vaccines and we are not doing parallel animal studies. Why would it be different with COVID?
Yeah, it's almost so difficult to explain how much of a shortcut was taken without having to go into a lot of detail. And again, I may not be answering your question, but in about 2007, 2008, I was on the Bioindustry Association Manufacturing Advisory Committee, and we went up to Liverpool to a plant there who was making the flu vaccine, and they were making the flu vaccine out of hen's eggs. So, and every year they had to predict what the strain of flu was going to be, and then they had to convert the hen's eggs into the vaccine to target that particular strain. And if it was a different strain, they'd have to remanufacture the vaccine. And very often they guessed wrong, and the flu vaccine actually wasn't right for the strain that was going that following year. So, but we know with the COVID vaccines, they seem to be able to treat or to be applicable to Omicron and all these different names that they had. And again, to me, that doesn't make sense, because you've got to make the vaccines suit the strain of virus that is out there. Now, I may not have answered your question there, Philip, so feel free to sort of re-ask it or
yeah, well, I think that I'm just trying to understand now, that where we are at the moment is that what I keep hearing is that, granted, maybe we didn't do as much animal testing as we would have liked. However, this was tested in the real world on people, and they are only finding very rare issues that are inconsequential to the purported benefits of giving it broadly to the population. What can you say?
Well, when you say they are finding very little and they're inconsequential, who are you quoting there?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, because that's not my personal view. This is just what I keep hearing all the time, is people are saying, listen, if there were any problems, we would have seen it by now because we've given 14 billion doses. Everybody seems to be largely okay. What's the big worry? Let's move on.
Can I jump in here now and refer to an FDA inspection of the Pfizer plant, the first Pfizer plant that made the Pfizer BioNTech vaccines. A company called Wyeth Biopharma. Pfizer acquired them about 2011. They were a mainstream biologics manufacturer. Pfizer had never been a biologics manufacturer. The FDA did an audit of the site, what they call an establishment inspection report, which is where 4 inspectors go in with the various scientific and technical skills, and they go right through the plant and they write a report. And if they're not happy with things, they write what they call a Form 483, which basically is the inspector's comments on what they saw. Now, I did a Freedom of Information request to FDA, and it potentially could have cost a lot of money, but they were quite kind to me because they gave me the establishment inspection report for the Wyeth Biopharma site, and there were 13 observations saying no quality control, operators weren't trained, process was out of control. You would not believe it, and you can't deny it because I've got a copy of it, and on my Substack, I circulate it. Now, with those issues of contamination and no control in manufacturing, the first thing you'd have to do is go in depth into where those drugs went, what happened to them, what happened to the patients who got them, because they would have been defective. And we know those first 33 batches made at Wyeth Biopharma had high levels of side effects associated with them, albeit maybe it's anecdotal, I don't know, because the people who should be collecting the data. And the other thing I should say is the responsibility for the safety of a drug sits with vigilance, says that every pharmaceutical company must have a process whereby they can identify serious adverse events within hours and take action on it. This yellow card scheme and the VAER scheme, that's a secondary backup. And none of these companies fulfilled their obligations to pharmacovigilance, and none of the regulators have picked up on that.
I think you've just touched on something there, Hedley, that is pretty important. Let me make sure I understand what you just said. Pharmacovigilance. So when the vaccines were being distributed globally, the responsibility lay with the pharmaceutical company to look for adverse events. Now, is this just in the trial because they did this in the trials, or would that expectation go to the broad rollout to the population?
Oh, broad rollout. I mean, it's written in all the regulations. You can see behind me as these are the 2022 regulations in the UK. Pharmacovigilance has got its own section, and you have to have processes in place. And when you are inspected by the regulators, they look at your systems, and you also have in the Europe, you used to have what they call a QPPV, a qualified person responsible exclusively for pharmacovigilance. That's a legal requirement. Now, where were those people?
Yeah, you touch on something. So you're telling me that when they had all these clinics popping up all over the world, pharmacists delivering vaccines, 15-minute monitoring. I mean, so what was the patient, or if somebody had a problem, even within 28 days, which I think is about the kind of standard observation period for vaccine, who should they have been reporting it to? Because you're pointing out it wasn't the doctor who was supposed to do just the yellow card. That's a backup system.
Yeah. No, well, and in I forget when it was. I do sort of interim work and consultancy work in the supply chain. I did it 12 months at Sandoz in Borden at the time, and I was working on the supply chain. But there were notices all over the place that said, you know, be alert if anyone here has a report of any sort of adverse event, you must report it to pharmacovigilance immediately. And the expectation was that they'd respond within 24 hours, you know, and take action. And that's well known in the industry. This is the amazing thing. That's so well known that I don't know how it's gone this long. People still thinking that is the yellow card system is the thing that's supposed, because how can a regulator, you know, look at the time lags with a yellow card system. You know, if you've got a serious adverse event, you want to stop that drug straight away if it seems that it's got issues. And a yellow card system, you know, by the time someone, well, lots of people didn't report. I know lots of people who had adverse events and they just didn't say anything because they, you know, so, and that's anecdotal, by the way, but the principle is that, and this principle applies to everything in the supply chain. The responsible company is the product license holder, and all the Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca drugs were approved. They were product license holders, and they're responsible for everything that goes on in the supply chain, even if it's outsourced to contractors.
No, I'm going to say something here. I recently did a post on the occupational OSHA in the USA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. There was a document in June of 2021 where they specifically said that they did not intend to enforce the 29 CFR 1904's recording requirements to require any employers to record worker side effects from COVID-19 vaccination. Literally, they went the opposite way, where they what's the word for it? They were discouraging employers from letting employees report adverse effects, which is what would happen in the workplace. Does that make any sense from pharmacovigilance?
No. I mean, if you look at the US FDA, the FDA part of the Code of Federal Regulations is Title 21. So 21 CFR. And it's all written out in there. All of it is legal because it, you know, all of it has come from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. That was written into the Code of Federal Regulations then, and it's been law ever since then. So you can imagine the shock when suddenly people were saying, "Oh, the PrEP Act, that countermands everything." You know, it's there's a pandemic coming up, and we have to ignore everything. I don't know whether I'm not an expert. I don't know where that PrEP Act came from, but I don't know how it could circumvent or, you know, or disable a code of federal regulation for FDA. What I would say is the new administration do seem to be, shall I say, doing some helpful things at FDA in terms of issuing these complete response letters, where they tell companies when their drug has failed, they tell them why it's failed. They've also introduced inspections typically before, if you inspected a site outside of the US, you had to give 6 weeks notice. They've now announced just inspections at the drop of a hat, so they could go to a company, because in Europe, if you got 6 weeks notice, you're going to have plenty of time to sort things out. So
I'm going to interrupt you here and say something, Hedley, and I want your thought on it. But it's something that you probably don't know a lot about. But I'm interested more from a vigilance and supply chain process. Over the past month and a half, I have noticed that there is one topic that causes the most aggressive negative response from people around who criticize what I say and so on. And it was to do with an interview with Christy Grace about the principle of adduction. What she said is that, because she worked in the industry, she said that one of the issues was that some of the ionizable lipids in the lipid nanoparticles, so not the mRNA, they are used to stabilize the mRNA. But if they get a charge on them, they can then bind to proteins, to other RNA, or potentially even DNA if they got in the nucleus. And that adduction risk, like what happened with NDMA and Zantac, could then predispose to many issues, including carcinogenic problems. What she said is that she is sure that they haven't actually done detailed adduction tests, which would have been a standard requirement for any product that was using lipid nanoparticles. What would you say to something like that?
Oh, they can't have done those tests. I've looked at the guidance documents for these products. The variously called DNA vaccines and all sorts of things. But the amount of safety work that you have to do, to say it's extensive, it is a complete understatement. Again, I've got a copy of the document. If you read it, there's years of work, and what you described there, that takes time in itself, and those procedures have to be carried out. That data has to be identified and acted upon. And by acted upon, I mean it would bring the study to an end, because if you find in those sorts of things happening when you do the necessary tests, you cannot just go on and administer the drug to humans when you get to the clinical phase.
And so when we look at this now, because you are one voice who is speaking up about this, and rather than being supported, you yourself are being very heavily censored. You cannot be the only person in industry who understands and knows this kind of thing. What are other people thinking or saying?
Well, I think there's like an embargo on the whole industry. I know so many people who I've worked with who are they're just going along doing their job every day, part of this expedited way of developing and making drugs. And I've known the MHRA a long time, and a lot of them now have become consultants. And I just sense a whole a fear of anyone actually bringing up, sort of, remember how we used to make drugs, how we used to test them for safety, how we used to build a supply chain, how we used to make sure that all our contractors were doing the job they're supposed to be doing, how we were taking responsibility for the product that was going to patients. That has all disappeared. And, even the vaccine task force, I know people on there who were warp speeding these drugs. And I just can't understand how they can live with themselves.
It's a really serious question, because I tell you what, Hedley, and I don't know if people in industry understand this. I say this all the time from a medical point of view. Part of the reason why I believe that I have to speak out about these concerns is that I know that if and when this blows up in the future, saying that you didn't say anything, see anything, or do anything is not an excuse. And it means that the whole reputation of every aspect of the pharmaceutical industry will be decimated in the public's eyes. Even if they were doing the rest of it fine, even if they were following all of the rules subsequently, how could we as the public trust that this is being done at the same standard if everybody is seeing abnormal, poor practice and staying silent on it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and what people probably don't know is that there is another feeding frenzy going on now in pharma, which is we've got the obesity drugs. Okay, I think Mother Nature has got, I won't go into that, but we've got the whole biotech. We've got these tiny companies developing these hugely complex biologics. They've never done it before. A lot of them are just investors or scientists or who don't understand how you build a supply chain and keep it safe. But the supply chain is absolutely fundamental to any drug, because what the supply chain produces goes into the patient's body. Now, the supply chain for COVID was the finishing part of it was people in car parks, in marquees, who were thawing these drugs, and then that was going into the patient's body, by unqualified people. And I've been saying that for 4 years, and I thought it would be obvious, because prior to this, a doctor only ever got one vial in a carton with a patient information leaflet. He'd take the vial out, and it would typically be at 2 to 8 degrees centigrade. He'd take the vial out, he'd draw out 20 mil or 30 mil or whatever, and he'd inject the patient. No one does anything to it other than the manufacturing process, which was done under good manufacturing practice and good distribution practice.
I want to pause you there on that thing with the temperature, because you're making me think now. So it had to be stored at minus 70 for some products. That's in a specific container. And then it's taken to a distribution location, which could be a marquee or a pharmacy or wherever. What is the transition, meaning that there must therefore be specific instructions about how you then get it up to room temperature and what time frame that it's used for? What is that like?
Well, if we take the Pfizer injections as an example, it wasn't just one dose of one vial. There were 195 vials in a cardboard tray, and there were 5 or 6 doses in each vial. It wasn't just one, there were 5 or 6, and they were frozen down to minus 70 degrees C, and that's very cold. And they were passed into the wherever it was, the marquee or the car park or whatever, and the people there had to find the instructions on the internet. So normally you'd have standard operating procedures, part of your quality system. So people doing it would have detailed instructions on how they had to do it, and they also had to sign that they'd been trained in how to do it before they could do it. But here we had people who were taking these 195 vials, and they had to let them thaw down to in a refrigerator. But as I say, this is a bit like scaling up. When you thaw any product, it can change its molecular composition, because it's a bit like when you take something out of the freezer, it tastes differently to when you put it in there. You know, there are subtle changes, and you have to do freeze thaw studies, which proves that what you had when you started the molecular structure, you have got at the end, and those studies then define how you do the thawing. Well, none of that was done. So, and of course, with there being 5, when they were thawed and in the refrigerator, you then had to inject a saline diluent into the vial that contained 5 doses. You had to turn it up and down 10 times. These were the instructions. And then you had to draw out 1 dose, and you'd administer that to the patient, and then you draw out another dose until you'd used the 5 doses up. But of course, you're unlikely to get the same dose going into each patient, and so you've got the potential that you've got a different molecular structure of the drug going into the patient than was delivered into the vaccination center. You've got variation in the dosage that was given to the patient. And then there's the whole management of the inventory. People didn't really know, I've only used half this vial. What do I do with it? And how do I label it? And so you had people sort of trying to work out how should we be doing this? Because they were able volunteers, but they were volunteers, not skilled, qualified people, which you have in manufacturing. So, and we should have been asking very searching questions in those days. And I can remember seeing, I forget, a government minister talking to a reporter and taking him into the vaccine center, saying, "Oh, okay, I'll give you a jab here." No, that was ludicrous.
And so when you think about that purely from a supply chain perspective, and you look at the transition as to how the quality control could never have been smooth between centers and even between individuals. So the time frame, the injection dose, the way, so many variables would have been added into this. Based on the experience of prior drugs and therapeutics, if this got wrong and caused harm, what kind of numbers or percentages do you think could have been harmed just by poor supply chain infrastructure?
Well, we have an example, because in 2007, 2008, there was an example of heparin. Adverse events were reported in the US and in Europe, and it turns out that the company, it was Baxter was the company making the heparin, and the company they bought one of the raw materials off in China had substituted a toxic material for the authentic material because it's about 100 times cheaper, and numbers of patients died and adverse events, and that sent a shockwave through the whole industry. And that led, and there was a report written by Pew Health Trust, hugely detailed report, and that led to the Falsified Medicines Directive being passed in the UK and Europe in 2011. And that was the first time people realized the supply chain can kill people. If anything untoward happens, it doesn't have to be economic.
I'm sorry there. I think we've just, I think Hedley is back now. We just lost him for a second as he was breaking down. Sorry, Hedley, you just broke up a little bit just as you were talking about the changes to the law in 2011 and how that was then brought back in.
Yeah, it was recognized that the supply chain could kill people and damage people if anything untoward happened in the supply chain. It doesn't have to be economically motivated adulteration, which is the name they gave it. It could be anything like, particularly with biologics, there's contamination in the vessels because it wasn't properly cleaned. There's a whole range of things that could go wrong. And of course, you've all the stages of transfer from one site to another, and all the temperature variation. The Falsified Medicines Directive was passed, which really meant there were stringent controls. And the UK actually they abandoned that in about 2 or 3 years ago because they didn't think it was necessary. And so, the evidence is there.
So when we think about this now, Hedley, we are where we are. That's something I keep hearing all the time. The doses have been delivered. The therapeutic is still out there. The perspective from industry is that even though we've had some minor hiccups, we have largely been able to deliver this to over 14 billion doses, and we now have to continue. Where would you start with regards to how this whole process now needs to be managed in order to protect the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, well, what I will say is that the vaccines are in a class called advanced therapy medicinal products. And the MHRA in the 2022 edition of the Orange Guide, which is all the rules, said it was okay to manufacture these ATMPs in the hospital setting. And that's allowable now, and some hospitals are beginning to do it. And there's no quality system. Hospitals should not be manufacturing these drugs in the hospital setting. It is happening. So what I'm saying is the MHRA is allowing things to happen that are counter to the good working practices of the industry for the last 30 or 40 years. And I have a formal complaint in with the MHRA for not insisting that AstraZeneca recalled their injections because they just stopped selling them. They are obliged to make sure the entire supply chain is cleaned because, in the manufacturing process, suppliers in the supply chain are making 2 years ahead. So with all the volumes we were making, even though they stopped selling the product, there were still people making those drugs, and the vials and all the other components. And the AstraZeneca vaccine went to 170 countries. So, and the MHRA has a department called the Defective Medicines Reporting Center, and their job is to make sure that if something like this happens, there's no defective medicines left in the supply chain. And they refused to use that department to investigate this. And if they find there's defective medicines, and they will, they're obliged to say to AstraZeneca, you have got to recall these vaccines. And when that happens, then the whatever it is that comes out of the hat, that will blow the whole thing open.
It seems as though this is now in the realms of a gamble, where everybody's just keeping their fingers crossed that nothing goes wrong, because they can't afford to make any kind of pullback because the liability issue would be so significant if they did. Now, when we look at the amount of investment that has gone into now more therapeutics, mRNA, further vaccines across the world, even the UK wants to be a leader in this. if they try and do the studies that should have been done with the pandemic, they risk taking down the whole industry. Do they just continue to bypass some of these testing and just move forward?
I think the only hope we've got is that FDA now, with its new leadership, the head of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Review from the previous administration has left, and the new administration are really, from my judgment, are doing the right things. It's going to take time, but they're introducing controls, inspections, processes that are going to lead the world, because FDA has always been the gold standard. And I have to say that the standards of regulatory authorities around the world has really plummeted. And I think the MHRA probably has plummeted the further than any other regulatory authority in the world. And for people in the UK, that is serious, because you cannot trust that products approved by the MHRA are safe, let alone effective, are safe, because they are not applying the responsibility, the skills, and the important processes that they should be employing.
So when you think about where we are now, as we're coming to a close, Hedley, I want you to tie together where we should be going in terms of the changes, the challenges that are being faced, taking into consideration the risks. You have to recognize that nobody wants liability constraints on them. And so if anything you say is going to increase liability for industry or regulators, they will not do it. Is there a way moving forward, almost a moratorium, if you could think of it that way, where we have a chance to actually do what needs to be done and move the industry forward without the risk that has come from the pandemic?
Well, I think that the crucial thing is to say that the whole gene-modified cell therapy using CRISPR, the gene editing tool, has to be stopped, because we don't understand it well enough. This started in 1960. They started developing CAR-T therapies, which are gene-modified cell therapies, in 1960. And I put the timeline in the book that's just come out of how long it's taken to get that to market. Because, when you put a drug in someone's body, you cannot base it on the theory that you put a gene-modified cell into someone's body and it's going to have an effect. Patients are different. There's all sorts, aside from the supply chain issues, there's all sorts of other issues. So it's not proven that these are scientifically sound, let alone or medically sound. Cessation of developing these products, and the main ones at the moment are the CAR-T cell therapies, which we know have got they've got the highest black box warning, FDA black box warning you could possibly have on them, because they cause neurological toxicities, a cytokine release syndrome, and secondary cancer. So that's a formal FDA warning on products that are still on the market for rare blood cancers called CAR T-cell therapies.
So these are the challenges that industry has to face at the moment. And I am worried that they have underestimated. And when I say they, I mean your colleagues, your experts, your consultants in the industry who have seen these things happening, have remained silent primarily because of a fear of, it does come with a cost if you try and speak out. And so I can understand that fear in the industry. But my concern and my warning could be that this whole situation could destroy completely any credibility that the pharmaceutical industry has at the moment. I am very worried that there doesn't seem to be any appetite that they want to take this on. What are your final thoughts on that?
No, I don't think they want to take it on. There's been a lot of hype about these products, but no one actually gave any thought to, are these practically deliverable? It's like we've made some sort of plane or something with 4 wings and 10 sets of wheels, and we think that's the next big thing in the aviation industry, and it turns out it's not working. You have to stop it and go back to basics. There's so many drugs that could be repurposed now. 90% of drugs are generic. The only drugs the big pharma companies really have got are these CAR-T therapies and the drugs for obesity and insulin for diabetics. Big pharma companies have really, they've gone through the valley of death, which became the patent cliff, and now they've almost got no products at all to actually sell. The only ones they've got are $500,000 for one treatment, and with very nasty side effects.
And so I want you to show us again, Hedley, your book, so that it can be plugged. It is straight up Transforming the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain, recently published, and it's available on Amazon, I assume, is it, Hedley?
Yeah, it's on Amazon and it's on the Wiley website, and it's £85, so I'm not trying to sell it to people unless they really want to understand. But it's having a lot of attention on LinkedIn, and I've got 11 experts in there from various disciplines. So I've got great hope, and I would like to think that Philip, we could work more on the doctors, getting more involved in drug development. If I can tell you a bit more about that, I think that would be good.
Yes, that's a whole different conversation, I think, Hedley, and I'd look forward to that. So yes, thank you very much again, Hedley. I'll want you to wait with me again just for the outro. Thank you, everyone who has been with us. We hope you found this insightful, and we will always continue to bring you the latest in science as we continue to explore. Thanks again, Hedley, and just wait with me just for a moment.